Thank you all for joining us. My name is Anjani Jain. I serve as Senior Associate Dean at Yale School of Management, and I'm delighted to welcome a distinguished guest, Dr. Arvind Subramanian, about whom I'll say just a little bit, but I also want to thank Professor Pete Schott in our economics faculty for co-hosting this conversation. He is the subject matter expert, not me. But I had the chance to lead a group of students last year. Some of you are here, and visit with Dr. Subramanian last March. And we came late. We inevitably got stuck in traffic, but he was still gracious enough to host us on a day that was especially hectic. Christine Lagarde was in town, and about 15 minutes into our meeting, he finally had to be pulled out because he got called by the Prime Minister for a briefing. So we were fortunate to see him, at least for a short while. I'll just say a few things by way of his background, and then essentially turn it over to all of you and Professor Schott for an informal Q&A. Dr. Subramanian, as I mentioned, is a distinguished economist who has worked both in the academy and outside, and now is in a prominent role as the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India in the Ministry of Finance. He succeeds in that role another distinguished economist, Professor Raghu Rajan, who is now, as most of you know, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India. And I think the fact that we have these two great economists at the helm, both in the Ministry of Finance and the Reserve Bank of India, augurs extremely well. I might be so bold as to say that at no point in Indian post-independent history, especially in my lifetime, have the stars been so aligned for the leadership of economic policy to be done on a wise and well-informed basis. And so it's a pleasure to engage Dr. Subramanian in a conversation. His background, as most of you know, academic background is in economics from St. Stephen's College in Delhi. Then he got an MBA from the Indian Institute of Management at Ahmedabad, and got an MPhil and a DPhil from Oxford. And he's long been associated as a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute, and has also taught at Harvard Kennedy School and a number of other academic institutions. So it's a pleasure to welcome to Yale School of Management, Dr. Arvind Subramanian. So just to set the conversation in motion, I'll ask him just a broad question to ask him to share his thoughts about the current state of the Indian economy. What you see is the direction, looking 3 or 4 years ahead. And perhaps one way to sharpen the focus a little bit is to talk about things that India must get right in the next 3 to 5 years to ensure a steady, stable economic growth.
First of all, thanks to the Yale School of Management, Anjani and Peter for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. These are really very, very interesting times, around the world, but also especially in India, because we've had this new government come in with a relatively unencumbered political mandate. It turns out to be a little bit more encumbered than we had thought. A relatively unencumbered political mandate for reforms and change. And I think that this is happening also at a time when the world economy is really become much more uncertain. I mean, I like to say that the newest normal is turbulence and volatility in the international system, and so it's at this it's against this background that the Indian economy is kind of going to be assessed, but also it's going to be performing in some ways. So the good news, hot off the press today, is the latest GDP number came out in India. there's an increase in growth from 7.1 last quarter to 7.4. I believe India is going to be the world's largest growing economy, fastest growing economy amongst all the major economies. And to think about, of 7.4%, in these times, it's not a mean achievement at all. So I think the way to look at the economy is that we went through a difficult phase in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. We had somewhat lost control of our macroeconomy. Growth was decelerating very rapidly, and then the new government came into power, took a number of actions. Some helpful external conditions like decline in global prices of oil and so on. So where we stand today is that the Indian macroeconomy is actually quite stable now. Inflation's been coming down dramatically. The fiscal deficit has come down. Our reliance on foreign capital has come down. So externally also, we're relatively robust. We've built up a war chest of foreign exchange reserves that cushions us against all the volatility of capital flows. So the macroeconomy is stable. And then the aim of the government very much is to kind of unleash a set of growth-enhancing reforms so that, over the medium term, the 3 to 5 year period, we can get as close to double-digit growth as possible. Because, the fact is that an economy like India needs those kinds of rapid rates of growth, both for the poverty alleviation agenda, but also to, the way I like to put it is that, you need this rapid growth in a sense for two kind of broad objectives. One is the people at the bottom have to be pulled up, and that's the poverty alleviation. The economic survey that we wrote last year, that is one of the jobs that I have to do. We said, that's the kind of the wiping every tear from every eye agenda. That's, getting people at the bottom out of poverty and providing. And the second thing, of course, which I think maybe many of you are more familiar with, is that, India has become a kind of aspirational economy, and it's young, dynamic, and aspirational. So, and the aspiration has come from having seen rapid rates of growth for now, 20, 30 years. So in order to meet the demands of this aspirational India, we need to generate the employment opportunities, and that's what, above all, rapid economic growth is going to do. So the government is committed to a reform agenda. I think that agenda has been, being pushed along steadily. There are a number of things that have been done, and we can discuss that, and also a number of major reforms looming on the horizon. And I think if all this can be done, I think we can, create the conditions for this move to, as close to double-digit growth as possible.
Great. Pete. So I guess the stars are aligned, things look really good. I was wondering what you thought the key reforms that need to be done in order to, from your perspective, what are the key reforms that, in order, what would you like to push for kind of more sooner rather than later? Yeah, see, the thing, Pete, is that I think that one has to be a little bit careful here because, if I put out a list, that shouldn't, both, it will convey my sense of, this is the most important thing, and maybe, the politicians may not think that that's the most important thing, in which case it's a bit of a problem. But I think that. Yeah. So what would one maybe put on a list? Exactly. So I think firstly it's all cumulative, and all the things that you do add up, and there's no one thing that I think is huge. For example, the government has implemented a series of reforms to attract FDI, to ease the cost of doing business, and I think that's a real, in order to attract private investment in India, I don't know how many of you know it, doing business has not always been easy. So there's a major effort to, as part of the Prime Minister's Make in India vision, to ease the cost of doing business. And in fact, India has been on mission mode for about a year on this, and the latest rankings that came out, we've jumped up within the course of 1 year 10 to 12 spots, depending on whether the World Bank is measuring it or the World Economic Forum is measuring it. So I think that's a big part of the agenda. So I think going forward,
the bankruptcy law, which is going to be passed by, which is to Parliament, because in India, I think one of the things I think that maybe all of you know this already is doing management is that, if you want to create a kind of, a market-based economy, as important as having free entry, is having exit as well. And I think in India, the challenge has been that exit has proved difficult in many, many sectors. So the bankruptcy law that we're going to, it's going to be submitted is going to ease exit, which I think is very important. The other thing which of course looms on the horizon is the major indirect tax reform that the government is contemplating. It's called the GST, the Goods and Services Tax. It's like a value-added tax, but the ambition of the Indian enterprise is truly remarkable. It's going to be a tax on goods and services, a common tax to be implemented both at what you would call the federal level and the central level, and it has to be coordinated between the two. It requires a constitutional amendment to get that done. It requires an amazing infrastructure of, a tax administration infrastructure using technology. So we were kind of on the verge of this. I mean, it's political. You need to get the political consensus to go through. But if that were to happen along with what we're doing on the other side of tax reform, India could have, a 21st century tax system, both on the direct tax side and on the indirect tax side. So that would be, I think, very important as well. So these are some of the things that have either happened or in the process of happening.
So I guess one of the things that's so fascinating about India is the extent to which, so as a democracy, the politics intersect with economics.
Yeah.
And so the recent elections, I'm wondering how that's going to complicate your life or not complicate your life in the sense that the politics is handled by others, and actually how does that all work? And
so I think see one of the when this government came into power, there were really very, very high expectations of the government. So one of the things that we wrote in this economic survey was that there are kind of two kind of broad regularities about, if you look across the world, post-war economies, major Big Bang reforms, I think, happen under two sets of conditions. One is when close to or in the aftermath of crises. That's when you get big reforms, because there's a sense of urgency.
Like the 91 reform.
Like the 91 reform, and all over, you look at, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Russia and everything, all the big reforms have something to do with crisis. The second is that, it's much more difficult to do, big bang reforms, not just in a democracy, because I think, because of all the checks and balances, but because of really what is a really unwieldy democracy in India, where power is not at all concentrated. I mean, it's a bit like what President Obama finds himself with here. You think, here's the world's most important man, but actually the levers of power are just distributed horizontally. It's not just the Prime Minister of India, but Parliament has a huge say. The Supreme Court has a huge say. A number of regulatory institutions have a huge say. And of course, power is also dispersed vertically, where many of, aspects of economic policy are actually determined by the individual states. We're 29 states. So take, for example, labor laws in India, for example. That is a matter that can be, regulated at the center. It can be regulated by the states. It can be regulated together. So when power is so dispersed, I think it's very difficult, to say do big bang reforms, because at the back of your mind when you think about big bang reforms is that you think there are these 3 or 4 levers of power that you can just pull, but then those levers are, everywhere, and so in that sense, I think, so it's a kind of circuitous answer to your question is yes, that not just because it's a democracy, but because it's a federal democracy with dispersing, it is more difficult to introduce big bang reforms. There's so many checks and balances, and so that complicates matters. But then I think that the way I read the latest election is, I read it in some sense somewhat positively in the following sense, that I think it reinforces the view that I have, maybe I'm a bit biased here, that in the last, I would say, 10 years or so, I mean, good economics is becoming more and more good politics. And the latest election is also, I think, a kind of, a validation of that broad assessment that I have about the economy, that, if you do reforms, if you deliver growth, if you deliver low inflation, if you deliver employment opportunities, if you deliver agricultural growth in India, for example, because 50 to 60% of the population still lives in agriculture. It's a small factoid that my finance minister often tells me, is that the few local, state level leaders who've been re-elected 3 times, who've had 3 stints in office, have all been those who've delivered rapid agricultural growth of about 7-8%, because that's where a vast majority of the population lives. So if you deliver opportunities for them, you're going to be rewarded in the polls. So I think that it's actually, on the one hand, democracy complicates policy making, but on the other hand, if good economics can be good politics, I mean, hey, this is a really exciting thing to...
so then there's reason to be optimistic about
absolutely.
the upper house not blocking the...
Yeah, I think, I think part of the hurly-burly of politics is, you've got to do the deals, and you've got to, get people on board, and, all of that is... And I think it's already happening with the GST, the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister met the opposition leaders. And so I think that in that sense, I'm actually very, very hopeful that this, the combination of a government with a mandate for change, combined with, this underlying good economics becoming good politics, is something that's... And the other thing, frankly, I'm very encouraged by is that, I mean, and this is one of the things I often want to tell management students in particular, is that this is kind of, sorry for a slightly philosophical digression, and this is, management students, and you think of, the corporate world, and you think in terms of, leaders taking decisions, and, a lot of agency, I mean, all of you are here finally because you believe that you can change the world, and, you change the world, and that's absolutely right, and that you should have that. But I think one thing that you learn if you're reading history and, stepping back, is that one should also look at what are the underlying endogenous forces that generate change, not necessarily related to individual A or individual B. It's kind of a little bit the Tolstoy, view of history, that it's not just about leaders or whatever, is that, so in the Indian context, what I'm also very encouraged by is that the way change is happening is via competition between states. So power is dispersed, right? So then, of course, it complicates matters, but then if some leader in some state says, I want to do good things like creating an investment climate, then that is going to exert pressure on other states and other jurisdictions also to change. And it can happen as, I call this, states can both be models and magnets. Models, because then you can say, well, it worked here, no one else has the excuse to say it can't work there, because it's worked within India, not just somewhere internationally. And as magnet, because a state that does well then attracts labor, capital, talent, technology, which it's going to. And in India, for example, one of the most famous examples is that the Tata company, which wanted to set up this nano factory, it 6-7 years ago was supposed to set this up in a state called West Bengal, a kind of Marxist ruled state in the past. And there were all these land issues, and then, it couldn't be created there. In the old India, about 20 years ago, this project would probably have been nixed. But then, several other states came up and said, including the Prime Minister's state, who was then the Chief Minister of that state, said, we will give you the conditions to come and create this. And so that competition between states dynamic is really a very powerful force for change in India. And I think you see many examples of that happening in India. Some states do delivery of services very well, then other states emulate that. So I think broadly, I'm very hopeful. It's a combination of this new leadership with a mandate for change. It's this good economics becoming good politics, and this underlying dynamic of competition. So it's a very exciting place. I think I don't know how many of you. To me, I think India today kind of is like the United States after the Civil War. The dynamism of hopefully not robber baron capitalism, but some of the energy and dynamism.
If I may pick up on a few of your comments, Arvind, the social dimensions of the transformation that are taking place. So just in aggregate terms, and you mentioned the lagging productivity of the agricultural sector, which has been a sort of bane of Indian economic growth since independence. It still lags behind the 8-point-some%. So agriculture, if I remember correctly, is about 18% of GDP, yeah. But it employs still 65% of the labor force. So as India goes through this transformation in the next 5-10 years, what happens to the workforce?
Yeah.
And if the agricultural sector is going to become more productive, as it must, then what happens to the social dimension? I was thinking, you mentioned the US after Civil War. So the number I remember is at the turn of the century, the last century, 1900, 40% of the US labor force was employed in agriculture. Now that proportion is down to 0.5%. It's not that agricultural production is any less than it was 100 years ago. It's that it became so much more productive. But the US is perhaps not the right example for India in terms of agricultural productivity with the large holdings. But if you look at Japan, Italy, some of the smaller European countries, there again, the agricultural sector accounts for about 4 to 6% of GDP and about 4 to 6% of the labor force. So in India, even compared to China, the disparity remains huge. And I wonder what happens to the rural population, especially as India goes through this transformation.
So I was last week. I gave a lecture on agriculture at not far from one of my places where I studied. India is actually about 30 years ago, one of the big successes of Indian kind of agriculture is our milk revolution, what's called the white revolution. It started by this man called Verghese Kurian, who created this thing called Amul. It's now a major global brand as well. And so I gave this talk on agriculture, and I think the point you made is actually a very good one, which is that, you look all around the world and you study economic development. By definition, development is about getting people out of agriculture, by definition. But the key thing is whether you get them out of agriculture in the context of rising agricultural productivity or in the context of stagnant or declining productivity. Because, if it happens in the context of rising productivity, first you can get the food to feed the population. You can get people out of poverty because nothing improves poverty as rapidly as agricultural growth. Also in India, and this we're actually encountering now, that if agriculture doesn't do well, it can set back the rest of the economy via its effect on inflation. That if you have high and a lot of high inflation in agriculture in India was because of agriculture, and so you address that as well. And finally, when you get people moving from agricultural to the thing, you want them to be educated, skilled, etc., so that you get good urbanization rather than bad urbanization, which is the push. If you're pushed off the factory with limited skills, then you're probably going to end up in low productive jobs even where you are. So I think the point is actually a very good one. So while we focus on manufacturing and services and creating all these, so you need to create the opportunities outside agriculture as well, but then you need to create the wherewithal within agriculture to ensure that that transition is smooth. And this is, I think, so India cannot afford to neglect agriculture, do so at its own peril. And of course, this is something that I'm not being an agricultural economist, but when I've gone back to India, and this is honest to God true, that during the monsoon, every day I would open the paper to see, what is the status of the monsoon every day. Is it 15% shortfall or 12% shortfall? Because it has a huge impact on India, and I think that, and of course with climate change, the stresses in agriculture are much more acute. We've had 2 successive droughts, which is 4 seasons of poor agriculture after 20 years. And if this is a signal of a portent of ominous things to come, then really we need to really address agriculture, which means water management, new technology, bringing in the private sector. So and the government is very, very I think now aware of this, that we need to really focus or refocus on agriculture.
So is there interesting variation across states in terms of agricultural policies, like you were mentioning before, in terms of manufacturing?
Yeah, a lot of variation. It's a bit like so there's variation on so many dimensions in agriculture. For example, what different states grow, for example, right? There are parts which are rain-fed, where the monsoons are good, and parts which are better irrigated. And then there are parts which grow cereals like rice and wheat, and there are parts that grow other crops. One of the slightly, things about Indian agricultural policy that I think needs to change is that we focused a lot on cereals. We had the Green Revolution. So rice and wheat are, I think, relatively better encouraged. And the kinds of stuff like pulses are less encouraged. And I think as India becomes richer, there's a huge dietary transformation as well. We want more proteins. Angus Deaton has done all this work on Indian agriculture, where we show that, we are actually consuming less cereals and calories at our stage of development compared to others at comparable stages of development, and eating more proteins. And given that a lot of us are vegetarians, I'm not, but a lot of Indians are, the demand for proteins is going to be very high. So we need to focus on pulses quite a bit, and productivity in pulses is not so great. So I think there's a lot of regional variation in that as well. Pulses, require less water, so they're better. They fix the soil in a way that cereals don't. So I think, there's a lot of scope for innovative, creative policy on agriculture that takes account of these various. For example, the other thing is that Gujarat, which is the chief minister's state, is one of those few states that actually used technology and got in BT cotton. So there's a kind of cotton boom in Gujarat because of using a new technology. Of course, a lot of opposition in India to this whole genetically modified stuff. Big debate there, and I think that's where we need to, think seriously about how to change. So again, a lot of regional variation there too,
Yeah. You said before that when I asked about the list of things that might be on yours in terms of getting things done first. So many of these problems are interlocking, right? So my understanding, agricultural sector, that you have like land policies where the plot sizes are shrinking, and so that's impacting productivity. On the distribution side, you have what might be described as imperfect competition in terms of distribution. So when you have a problem, so agriculture clearly important, right? How do you go about conceiving of the strategy for pushing things along? Is it all in one? Do you let local leaders kind of do what works and encourage them to do more? I mean, how does that
I think it's in all these things, it's a combination of things that the center can do on its own, like setting prices for minimum support prices for farmers for all the crops. It's something that the center does.
Yeah.
We have a commission which looks into costs and prices, and before every season you say these are the minimum support prices for all these crops. And actually I have had some role to play in this as well, trying to stress that let's not give more incentives to kind of water guzzling crops in rice and wheat, and instead favor these crops that use use less water, less nitrogen, and cater to the protein thing. So that's something, and then that has to be supplemented with how do you incentivize the states to do what I think. Sometimes they do it on their own, but sometimes, you need carrots and sticks to do that. And then that's political as well, because there are some states which are ruled by the same party as the party in power at the center. There are different states. So I think the art of policy making in India is so much, the art of political policy making, we're just technocrats providing advice, is really navigating this terrain of, center state politics. And it's, and that's a big part of this.
I'm going to open it up soon to questions from the audience. We have both faculty and students here, but as you think of a question, perhaps let me jump in with somewhat of a change in topic. Over the years, when our students and I have gone back to visit, we often meet with corporate leaders, and so they share a lot of the optimism you laid out, Arvind. The two themes that sort of recur by way of lamentation sometimes have to do with the rampant corruption in the country, and also perhaps equally strong, the lack of infrastructure, and that goes straight to how business-friendly the environment is. The question I wanted to ask you is, what role do you see for economic policy in these domains?
So the first one's corruption, second one was?
Is lack of infrastructure.
Infrastructure, okay. So on corruption, let me say that, I think one of the major achievements of this government was, in fact, in addressing big-ticket corruption. Because remember that under the previous government, there were these major scandals, all relating to, scarce resources. Coal, spectrum, land. In India, I devised, I came up with a term for it. I think I called it, the rent-seeking Raj.
Right.
And I said there were terrestrial rents, subterrestrial rents, and ethereal rents. So you had rents from all these, auctioning all these scarce resources. And in fact, so when this government came into power, the first thing it said was, all these would be auctioned through transparent processes. So I think governance of the big items like, so coal is now being auctioned completely, spectrum is being auctioned, and as far as possible, I think land is also going to be. So I think, and even there was, governance issues related to imports of gold, which I think the government addressed by liberalizing gold. So I think this is a major, I think, achievement of the government. So now, remember that, just to get a bit philosophical and to go back to the robber baron era, I think dynamic capitalism, to think that there will be no corruption when capitalism is dynamic is really wishful thinking. And I think that, that's not to condone it, but I think that's just the way I think rapacious capitalism works. So I think that you see in India, I'm sure, like you've seen elsewhere. But I think the government is really, committed to, in fact, part of the lamentation of industry is that they don't have as much access to the powers that be, and it cuts both ways. So you don't have access, so you feel your voice is not heard. But then if you have too much access, then the whole specter of corruption rises. So I think drawing that balance is actually quite difficult. But I think the corruption thing is, but the petty corruption that probably is probably really damaging. I think that's something that will, take time to change, and I think so. On infrastructure, I think that it's true that infrastructure in India has been one of the deficiencies. And again, now if we had this boom in infrastructure, when the world economy boomed, we had this, the problem was that there was a lot of excess associated with that infrastructure boom. We had a model where, we had PPP, public-private partnerships, doing the infrastructure during the boom period, roads, power. Now, when the world economy came down and all that happened, we've been left with an overhang of really bad assets from that infrastructure boom. So we have to work through that, to create the next investment boom in the private sector. We have to work through that. So that is why, meanwhile, one of the things that we did in this budget was to say that, look, private investment in infrastructure is going to take some time. So we need to, in the interim, boost public investment. So in this budget and probably, going forward, there's been a lot of emphasis on, public investment in roads, public investment in railways, public investment also in irrigation. So that's going to be a big part of the infrastructure story going forward. Because I think the private sector interest in investment is going to take a little bit of time to come back to the kind of resurgent levels that it was a few years ago.
Should we invite questions? Okay. Please introduce yourself and then state the question.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Karandeep Singh. So my question is basically...
And you are an MBA student.
Yes, I'm a class of 2017 MBA. So my question basically builds on two of the comments that you had. One was on the distribution of power. The other was, at what context do you build a revolution into, say, at what point of productivity do you want to pull people out of the agricultural setup, right? So how much of the reforms that we see, because of the difference of opinion and the distribution of power, actually builds on the acceptance of the DNA of what India is and what she can be, and how much of it builds from a visual thinking of what people want to see it become and the amount of peer pressure that you have globally?
Very, very, very good question. I think that, obviously both are at work. And I think that there is a sense of an idea of India, right, which I think most Indians buy into. So that means that this is not going to be China. This is going to be a model where growth and economic policy will have to be accompanied by inclusiveness. And inclusiveness not just in terms of outcomes, but in terms of processes. That's what I think is this idea of India. I'm trying to remember something that I wrote about the idea of India. It'll come back, but I think that's the intrinsic part of this. But then, of course, I think that we now live in a global world, and therefore, even take, for example, what is happening now in terms of the global economy. So, one of the things I think India has realized in the last, I would say, since the global financial crisis, that we are much more integrated than anyone would have thought we were. Whether it's in terms of capital flows, whether in terms of trade, whether it's in terms of the diaspora, whether it's in terms of ideas, technology. I think there is now no getting away from the fact that, and even how we take part in global negotiations like, the climate change or thing, has come with the sense that, we're integrated with the world, we matter for the world matters for us, and therefore we can no longer afford to, behave in this, isolationist manner, and I think that's absolutely, and that's both a challenge and a huge opportunity. It's a challenge because I think, and this is where your two questions are related. It's a challenge because, in some ways, a democracy like India, it's very fiercely protective of sovereignty. You want to be able to say, we do this because we are doing it and not because it's being imposed from the outside. So that's, I think, the challenge part of it. It's part of the idea of India that you have. But then the opportunity is that, the world is a place where, it's a market, it's a source of ideas, and, the Indian diaspora is very, very, after all, the Prime Minister came to India, to the US, and, Madison Square Garden, he was in in Wembley in the UK, you know. So it is a sense, it's a kind of a very nice illustration, not just that India is integrated in a general sense, but in this very particular sense of you know, the diaspora and you know, what all that means to India. So I think, so both of these are at work. So, but it's a very good question. Rahul.
My name is Rahul Gupta, second year student here at SOM. Thanks a lot for spending your time with us. We actually had the pleasure to meet you in March, so thanks a lot for coming again.
Great to be here.
I wanted to get your thoughts on climate change. You spoke a little bit about its effect on agriculture. So India is committed to a certain number of reduction in emissions by 2030. And you see the PM in Paris also speaking about how it's not just the responsibility of India, how it has to be an equitable distribution across developed and developing countries. I wanted to get your thoughts, because if everyone talks like that, then we are at a stage wherein it's becoming difficult for the environment. I wanted to get your thoughts on how difficult is it going to be to balance economic policy and economic growth with making sure that the pollution does not reach to different levels.
Sorry to be a little bit self-referential here. So I have a piece in Friday's Financial Times where I wrote a slightly controversial piece on climate change. I accused the US and others of carbon imperialism, which I'll explain. I'll explain in a second. But so let me say 2 or 3 things, which again, it's a very good question, something that I think is becoming really important in India. Now, first, on climate change itself, I think the point I was making in this piece is that, you know, if you have to reconcile India's energy requirements, and especially given the fact that, you know, 300-400 million people are not connected to the grid in a kind of way that you and I would be accustomed to, you know. So there's a huge energy access requirement. And that means in India, we will need to use coal quite a bit. Coal is going to be the cheapest and whatever source of energy. So the energy access requires that we use coal to whatever extent that we need to, but then that means, you know, our contribution to climate change cannot be as large as it would otherwise be. So what the piece says is that, you know, I think the world needs to come together, that while we focus on renewables, and that's great, and I think, you know, if renewables become competitive, that'll be great, but I don't think we're there yet. And Bill Gates has a very nice piece in The Atlantic 2 or 3 weeks ago where he says that renewables, if you properly cost renewables, it's not competitive with coal. So I think we need an international coalition to somehow try and make coal greener, so that, you know, you can then reconcile India's energy, and not just India, but many, you know, China has coal, the US has so much coal. The US is the world's, I think, 2nd largest producer of coal, you know, just to remind people. So to, you know, to reconcile that, I think, so that's one part of it. And I think, but the other part of it is that what is encouraging in India is that, you know, domestically, the costs of coal are becoming more and more. So it's not that India says, you know, we want to use coal because, you know, we want to use it and, you know, devil take the hindmost. I think we are aware of the costs of coal. You know, I live in Delhi, and in the winter, you know, Delhi is a nightmare because of the whole thermal inversion that takes place, and then, you know, atmospheric pollution is very high. So I think more and more the costs of pollution and the costs of using, you know, kind of dirtier forms of energy are becoming apparent. So that's why, you know, we have, you know, the government has actually introduced a coal tax. You know, went from 50 rupees to 200, quadruple the coal tax. And this is another point, I'm sorry to say, this is not just a debating point that I want to score against, you know, the US and others. You know, when the price of oil came down dramatically, about 50% reduction, India actually slapped on taxes. Of course, we did this also for fiscal reasons, but it was a way of indirectly taxing coal because, you know, this is, and I say the US and Canada actually passed passed on all the price onto the consumer. So in that sense, there is a little bit of kind of hypocrisy here that in terms of who's doing how much for taxing carbon and coal and so on. So I think there is a growing awareness in India that we have to have clean development, and that's why the Prime Minister has he has this massive ambition to ratchet up renewables production in India. We're going to go from 35 gigawatts today, that's 2015, to 175 gigawatts in in the space of 7 years, 2022, and that's the scale of the ambition.
Is most of that going to be thermal? Coal-based?
No. The renewables. This is 35. This is renewables. This is just solar, mostly solar, but also wind. So just the renewables agenda is huge. But then renewables cannot be, given the current state of technology and the price, cannot replace our coal, and we have lots of coal. It's dirty coal, but we have lots of it, but price-wise it's still competitive. So I think so India has to do more, the world has to do more, I think, to reconcile these two things for India.
I've been favoring this center. I'll get back to Shantanu, but let's take
Thank you, Dr.
Shashank.
Subramanian. My name is Shashank Iyer. I'm an MBA student at SOM and an MA student at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. I had a question regarding India's position with the TPP. There's a pretty vigorous debate going on in the US regarding the pros and cons of it. Where do you see, India is clearly not part of it right now, but do you see a future for India to be more integrated with its Asian neighbors, and especially with regards to the pharmaceutical patent provisions in it? How does India sort of continue to play a role and extract the opportunities from it, but protect itself as in all its measures?
Again, a very, very good question, and something that is becoming more and more, discussed in India. So I think the way to think about, the TPP in India, is that, for the last 5-10 years, India has had this look east policy, especially in economic terms, right? I mean, we have over the last 10 years been negotiating these free trade agreements with, Japan, Korea, and ASEAN. But I mean, these are not kind of what I would call, super ambitious free trade agreements. Now, TPP, I think, is just a seismic shift in the economic and trade landscape, because in a sense, it's going to bring together, 40% of the world economy, and it's a personal assessment. I don't think it's a matter of if, but only a matter of when China wants to and is going to join TPP. So for India to be, what looms is, this big dynamic market of which we're kind of potentially excluded. So that's, I think, the sense in which this is kind of a seismic development for India. Now, I think the way we're going to be thinking about this is that, on the one hand, being left out means lots of export opportunities are going to, India is going to miss out on these exports. But then on the other hand, there are also these huge regulatory harmonizes taking place in TPP, which frankly at this stage we're not prepared to be part of. I mean, and you've identified the most important one. I just do not think that, these intellectual property rules foreseen are something that we should or can live with. I mean, for us, access to cheap medicine is absolutely vital, and so I think that's where I think we have to start thinking about how then do we negotiate this landscape going forward. So there are these costs, and therefore there are lots of benefits from integrating, but then there are also these costs. So I think then it'll be some kind of combination of maybe looking at ways of modifying these regulations, and also thinking about this in a different time perspective. Maybe we're not ready to join now, but I think we have to, and then we have to gear up domestically to be able to be part of these arrangements over time. But it's I think a really big development that's happening, and it's something that we are now focusing more and more on.
Let's take one question.
Captain Balsara, I'm part of the executive MBA program. I I come from the healthcare sector, and what's really amazing is like India's become a destination site for many really high-level, high technical skill-based procedures. Yeah, but there's this other reality too, where the vast majority of the population is deprived this sort of care due to economic reasons. So I have a two-pronged question. The first is, I was reading about the 12th five-year plan, which is due to come out in 2017, and the mean GDP, or actually the median GDP, from what I understand, is across the world is 5% that's spent on healthcare expenditure. In the 12th five-year plan, it looks like there's still less than 2%, like 1.58% that's attributed for healthcare. And I was wondering if that allocation of that much funds is going to be sufficient to meet the needs of the population. And the second is a question about, in India, it looks like the constitution mandates that the health within, each state governs its own sort of health regulations, or whether we wouldn't be better off if we had a federal mandate for a minimum health standard. And because you would think that a sound, healthy constituency would be the basis of a sound economy.
Let me take the questions in reverse order. I'm not a I'm not a health economist, and so it's a little bit above my pay grade. But let me just say that on your second question, the Constitution is what it is, and I think that it's not easy to change that, but I think you're right that it's still possible for the center to set standards, create a mandate, push certain programs. So there is a sense in which certain things can, notwithstanding the Constitution, can be pushed in other ways from the center. So I think that's certainly possible. And to some extent, I think it was happened under the National Rural Health Mission, the NRHM, and that's being continued by this. But in a kind of recognizing this constitutional allocation of roles, what the government has done is this time is that we have these elaborate procedures for how fiscal revenues are shared between the center and the states. So this year, there was a constitutional body which recommended that a lot more resources be devolved to the states. And the government has done that. So in that sense, the mandate that this will be done locally is now backed up with more resources that state governments will have to do this on. Whether they will actually do that, remains to be seen. Now, on your first question, remember that one has to be, I think that education and health should be part of any governments and any society's top priorities, and don't get me wrong on that. But I think one also needs to have a slightly historical. When you say we are 2% and others are 5%, let's say, that's a comparison that I kind of little bit want to push back against, because maybe it's not the most appropriate comparison, because I would like to know what the US devoted at a comparable stage in its economic development, whether it was 5% even then. Also, I think it has to take account of, the demographic profile. Maybe older societies need more for healthcare than younger societies. I'm just saying that, these numbers per se, I think are not what I think should, drive, especially, how to interpret them. But I think my final point on healthcare is really, is more a generic point I want to make, is that often in India, we kind of obsess about resources, and I think, resources are a big part of that. But I think a lot, in fact, has to also to do with delivery and governance. And it's quite possible that at state level, we can get better outcomes even with the existing resource envelope that we have. So a greater emphasis on how do you get better delivery, at local level, should be as much part of our consciousness in thinking about health as just resources per se.
It's clear we're not going to get all your questions in the next 4 minutes. I did promise Shantanu, so let's.
Hi, Dr. Subramanian. I'm Shantanu. I'm a final year undergrad in Yale College. And I just had a couple of quick questions regarding, like, more so on the finance aspect of things. So I was reading this rather skeptical McKinsey report earlier this year, which basically said earlier, I think post-tech bubble, even before that, private equity returns were quite high, double digits, inflation adjusted. But now India is sort of losing out in those foreign funds, bringing their money out, not really investing at all in India, even in, say, agriculture, manufacturing, or infrastructure-related industries. And Brazil, Russia, China is sort of pushing it up. So I was just curious, like, two-part question. One, what do you think are some of the policy reforms? I guess bankruptcy law could be one, but long-term viewpoint of how India can sort of come back and try to still be a leader again and getting more funds to invest in India, and B, what are some of the key industries you think would be that would garner more support from foreign funds?
So let me, first of all, I think that, the last year has seen the biggest increase in FDI in India in terms of foreign direct investment. And so I think it's probably not totally fair to say, I would, if anything, say that, foreign financial participation in India has picked up, in the last 15 months or so. It's gone up quite a bit, especially FDI, which in some ways is kind of the form that we really need the most. So in that sense, but I think it's accompanied by a policy environment that's very clear. We're going to be much more open to FDI, and all other forms of financial investment also are being steadily liberalized. Consistently. How much foreigners can take part in government bonds, for example, those limits have been increased. How much they can take part in corporate bonds, that's been increased. How much Indian companies can borrow abroad. So it's a steady increase in the openness to all forms of foreign financial participation. Let me say here that as a personal, it's a personal kind of peeve of mine. I think I worry more about getting too much foreign money rather than too little foreign money. I think that the history of the last 25, 30 years, if you look at almost every emerging market crisis, if you look at the Chinese experience, if you look at the East Asian experience, I think foreign finance is not the panacea for development problems. It can actually, even in some cases, undermine domestic economic performance. So I would be, while the government is encouraging foreign finance, I think that we have to be mindful of all, almost every emerging market crisis has been preceded by, a huge inflow of foreign money coming in. And because the ability of governments to regulate this finance is always going to be behind, the regulator is going to be behind the curve in all instances, I think, so we have to be a little bit careful. And I think, the bigger tension is that if we want to make in India successful, i.e. to build a domestic manufacturing base, I think one of the key requirements is that you have to have a very competitive currency. And the more the foreign money that comes in, it makes it difficult to have that foreign currency. So I think it's a careful calibration game that we have to play. And so much as, all you people, doing MBAs, believe in, the ability of finance to come in and change India, and to some extent that's true, but we have to be quite careful about that.
I'm afraid we have run out of time. You have classes to go to. The classroom needs to be vacated. This could have gone on much longer. Some of you will have a chance to have a more intimate conversation with Dr. Subramanian over lunch. But I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. But let's thank our wonderful guest, Dr. Subramanian.